Before we get into the Season 4 recap, if you need a Season 3 recap of You, I put a tab in the upper right-hand corner. Check it out. Or a Season 2 or 1 recap. I have them all, so just head to the channel. But in Season 4, we find Joe in London. Now, how did he get there, you ask? Because Season 3 ended in Paris. Well, Joe was able to track down Marianne in Paris. It took about 2 weeks, but he was able to find her. She changed her look, and when she saw him, he didn't get the reaction he expected. He thought she would be happy, and she was terrified. He chased her down into an abandoned building, and all he wanted to do was talk. He said to her, "I really thought you loved me," and she said, "I did." That was until he killed Ryan. He defends himself, but she says, "No, the fact you're here right now, that means that love didn't kill you, and you killed love." She tries to get him to deny it, but he doesn't because it's the truth. And she figures because of this, there must be more. And he plays it up in his head that he's a good guy who did something bad, but it's way worse than that. She calls him a murderer, and Joe says, "No, you're wrong about me. I'm going to prove it to you." And he lets her go. He heads to a coffee shop to just be with his thoughts when he's approached by a man who was hired by the Quinn family, specifically Love's father, Ray. He didn't believe that Joe Goldberg died in that pie, so he hired this guy to track him down and kill him. But that day was Joe Goldberg's lucky day, because the guy doesn't want to hurt him. He's done hurting people. He gives Joe an option to pay him off for a new identity. He knows that Joe emptied out Love's bank account before he left, so he's got the money. And Joe agrees because it's a lot better of an option than getting murdered. The PI, whose name is Elliot, then slides an envelope over the table, and it's got Joe's new identity. He's going to be known as Jonathan Moore. It's got visas, it's got passports, it's got everything he wants. All he has to do is keep a low profile. There is one issue, Elliot tells him. It's the fact that Marianne knows that Joe Goldberg is still alive. So Joe's going to have to take care of it, a.k.a. murder her. Elliot found out that Marianne is taking a train the next day. He gives Joe his cell phone and says, "Text me when it's done." But Joe really meant what he said when he told Marianne, "You're wrong about me." He doesn't want to kill her. He has no interest in that whatsoever. He wants to prove her wrong. So when he gets to the train station, he pickpockets a necklace right off her neck, but he lets her go. And he takes a picture of the necklace and sends it to Elliot saying, "It's done." As far as Elliot knows, Marianne is dead. After that, with a new identity, Joe Goldberg headed to London to reinvent himself as a professor. He gets a job late teaching American Lit to a bunch of college students who love to argue with each other, and he kind of just bullshits his way through it. After one such class, one of his more eager students comes up to him and starts asking him questions about the class, but what he notices is the book that's in her hand. It's called A Good Man in a Cruel World, and it's written by a guy named Rhys. Joe's never heard about this guy, but apparently he's a huge deal in London. His book swept the country, and now people want him to run for parliament, mayor, whatever, but they think that he is going to be the savior. So Joe takes the book, he goes home, he reads it, and he loves it. He's shocked at how much he loves this guy's memoir. But what he's also surprised at is how much he loves London. He loves the fact that people actually read here. They treasure their books. He compares suburbia to hell, but this place is like heaven. There are some drawbacks, though, like a fellow professor named Malcolm Harding. Joe has to kind of be nice to Malcolm because Malcolm did hook him up with an apartment in his building, but Malcolm's just kind of a blowhard. He comes from a very well-to-do family that's pretty close to royalty, and in order to feel some purpose in life, he teaches when he doesn't need to. And he loves reminding people about that, his status in society. What he's really interested in is just partying and being a socialite, while also playing himself off as an academic. Joe hates this guy. Malcolm, though, can't pick up on this, so he keeps inviting Joe out, to which Joe keeps coming up with excuse after excuse on why he can't go out. The truth is, Joe just likes this quiet life he's formed in London. He heads home to his world of books, and he feels like he's living in a Hugh Grant movie. He's also delusional, though. He tells himself that this time it's going to be different. He's not going to become infatuated with anybody. But shocker, he sort of does. Because as he looks outside his window, he sees right into Malcolm's window. And the person he becomes a little bit infatuated with is Malcolm's girlfriend, Kate. Kate's mother was a model. She kind of became a little bit of an influencer, a little bit of a yogi, but Kate appears to be the exact opposite of that. She works really hard, while Malcolm just wants to party. That's what Joe becomes infatuated with, the fact that her work ethic is second to none. He can't figure out what someone like Kate is doing with Malcolm, But he also catches himself. He doesn't want to become infatuated with this woman. Doesn't matter. One particular night, he notices that she is enjoying herself a little too much. And the way that Joe interprets this, Malcolm must not be pleasuring her in the bedroom. Because they live in the same building, though, they do run into each other a little bit. And on one particular night, they're both leaving the apartment at the same time. She's a little bit in front of him, and the whole time Joe is telling himself that there's nothing weird about this. They're just heading the same direction. That's when he sees Kate get mugged by 2 people. And even though he tells himself not to get involved, he has to. It's a woman getting robbed by 2 men. He jumps in his car, he blares on the horn, and the 2 robbers flee. When he goes to check on Kate, it doesn't seem like she's all that upset and all that frazzled. She mentions how the watch that was stolen was something that she hated. She is, however, going to have to call the police, and to that, Joe says, all right, but can you do me a favor? Keep my name out of it. My work visa's a little bit shaky. She doesn't give him much confirmation on it, so he sweats out this police report, thinking the entire time that she absolutely mentioned his name to the police, and they're going to look into him. And while Kate didn't seem all that appreciative of the fact that Joe saved her from these 2 guys, Malcolm is. He's very appreciative. When he hears the story from Kate, he rushes over to Joe's apartment and thanks him profusely. And he wants to repay him, so he's going to invite him out that night to a big socialite party at a new club that is only for rich people. Joe does not want to go. Joe also has no chance. He's getting dragged to this thing. That night, Malcolm, Kate, and Joe head to Sundry House. And it really is this elitist group. Joe's prepared for the vapid egos that he's about to face. He did his research. First person he meets is someone named Lady Phoebe. She's Kate's most famous friend. She's been famous since the age of 15. Everything's documented in the press. But to everybody out there, she portrays herself as the sweetest person in the world. Her boyfriend is an American named Adam Pratt. He's the owner of Sundry House. This kid wasn't born on third base. He was born an inch away from home plate. Daddy's money has paid for his lifestyle, and it allows him to think that he actually works hard when he doesn't. The next person is someone named Blessing Bosede. She's a Nigerian princess, and she's made most of her money in tech, although they all feel like a pyramid scheme. Then there's the Sue siblings. Simon Sue portrays himself as a struggling artist, even though it's all a lie. He comes from money, and he has no idea what it feels like to struggle. His sister Sophie is really smart. She went to Oxford, she went to Harvard, but then she realized she can make a better living being an influencer on the gram, so that's what she does. After witnessing an interaction between Sophie and Malcolm, Joe's pretty sure that Sophie hates Malcolm almost as much as he does. There's also Roald Walker Burton. He's mostly known for his boats, his one-night stands, and one hell of a knife collection. Gemma Graham Green has no filter and is extremely controversial while not giving a single fuck. And finally, the only person at the party that Joe can even stomach is Rhys Montrose. He sits down next to Joe, and he feels the same way that Joe does about these people. They're vapid, they're self-absorbed. He's the only guy at the party that Joe doesn't outright hate already. They have a short chat about how much Joe liked his book, but Joe realizes he's getting a bit too drunk. He's probably got to head home, so he tries to do that, and when he stands up, he realizes just how drunk he actually is. On his way out, he gets stopped by Phoebe, Gemma, and Kate. They hand him some absinthe. He drinks it, not knowing what it is, and boy, would that become a mistake. They start asking for his life story, where he came from, what he's doing there. Gemma and Phoebe seem to be friendly. Kate, on the other hand, seems to be pretty combative. Suspicious about who this mystery American is. While he had plans of leaving, the alcohol gets Joe to stay, and he reveals to Malcolm that what's making him, quote, so miserable is the fact that he was in love, and she didn't feel the same way. She broke his heart. Malcolm thinks he's being a really good friend by telling Joe that he looks pathetic, getting all sad over some, quote, silly whore, but Joe actually gets pretty upset over this, although he's too drunk to actually do anything about it. Joe stays at the party, but his condition's getting worse and worse until eventually he wakes up the next day with a very colorful coat that isn't his, having no idea how he got back to his apartment. As he's trying to put the pieces together of the night before, he looks to his right, and that's when he sees Malcolm. Dead body on his table, having died of a stab wound. And Joe thinks, oh my God, I did it again. Not the first time he's dealt with a dead body, so he goes into damage control, trying to clean up the mess, and he sees that he cut off Malcolm's pinky. So right away, he thinks, where the hell would I put a pinky? He heads in the kitchen, and when he looks out his window, he sees Phoebe talking to the police. At first, he can't believe that she already reported Malcolm missing, but then he thinks, no, I'm being too paranoid. She's probably talking about the mugging. But he realizes he has to get that body out of there ASAP. So he puts the body in the trunk and heads out to a sawmill to chop the body up. He does that, heads over to the River Thames afterwards, and throws the remaining pieces of Malcolm's body into the river. Later in the day, he heads back to Sundry House to return that coat, and he's surprised because he sees Rhys there. Rhys can tell by Joe's face that something went wrong the night before, so he tries to make him feel better. Joe equates it to something in Rhys's book, and Rhys tells him that he took some artistic liberties with that story. Well, Rhys has no idea about what happened to Joe, and he doesn't understand the severity of the situation. He tries to give him a little bit of a pep talk to make him feel better. Joe's disappointed because he felt like he was really doing better. He was starting this new life, and now he did it again. But after talking with Rhys, Joe actually thinks that he can be redeemed. He then heads off to work at the university where he runs into Kate. Just like the night before, Kate is pretty combative right out the gate. She asks Joe if he's seen Malcolm because he was the last one with him, and Joe, of course, plays it off like, no, I have no idea where he is. She then invites him to dinner that night. They're having a soiree for Simon, who's opening up a new art show. She also does not take no for an answer. She tells Joe that Phoebe insisted he be invited. She really took a liking to him, even though it's clear that Kate has not. She's very suspicious and makes it known to Joe that she doesn't trust him yet. That's going to have to be earned. Right before she does leave, though, she puts Joe's mind at ease by telling him she told the police she had no idea who saved her. And then she says, I'll see you tonight. That night, Joe heads to the soiree, but before he heads in, he gets an interesting message on a cryptic app. It's one of these apps that the elitists use because after you read the message, it disappears. The message says, you surprised me handling Malcolm like that. Here I thought when I left him on your table, you'd go down for my sins. You're not who I figured you for. So who are you? The good news for Joe is he knows that he didn't kill Malcolm. The bad news is he knows that he's about to go to dinner with a bunch of people, and one of them did. One of them wanted Malcolm dead, and one of them pinned it on Joe. So who is it? In episode 2, Joe goes to the soiree, but he's distracted the entire time. He can't get his mind off of who actually killed Malcolm. When he gets back to his apartment, he's got an invitation that was slid under the door. It says, your presence is requested at a night to die for. And on the back, there's a QR code. The invitation, though, is just for Simon's opening night of his new show. That's it. It's hosted at the same art gallery that Kate runs. Kate is a prime suspect for obvious reasons, but when Joe sees her at the university, she's calling Malcolm, and she seems legitimately concerned that she hasn't heard from him. He wants to take her off the suspect list, but then he thinks, well, maybe she did all of that because she's smart. He realizes he's going to need some help, and even though he hates this genre, he heads to the library and checks out a bunch of Agatha Christie murder mysteries. While checking out the books, that overeager student, Nadia, walks up to him. She's excited because she loves murder mysteries. And this sparks a conversation between the two on why murder mysteries aren't the worst thing in the world. While he wants to really argue with her, Joe knows that at this moment he needs her. He pretends that he's doing a special project and just needs to better understand murder mystery novels, so she helps him with all the tropes. Number 1, there are no coincidences. Number 2, all motives always boil down to sex, money, or revenge, one of the three. And 3, the first suspect is usually the second victim. Joe stops her and says, no, I'm thinking about just one violent murder. And Nadia says, well, then it's all about why that person was murdered. Somebody wanted them dead enough to plan it, then enact it with passion. He thinks about everything Nadia said, and then he thinks he's got it. He's pretty sure it was Elliot. Elliot did take his phone to, quote, put his number in it. He could have downloaded that app and just kept messaging him. So Joe decides to call Elliot up and confront him. But Elliot wasn't the guy. He has no idea what Joe was talking about. And if he's lying, he's extremely believable. After getting off the phone with Elliot, he gets a message from the murderer. The murderer comments on his brown jacket that he's wearing that day, and all of a sudden, Joe's got his head on a swivel looking around to see who might be messaging him, but he can't find anybody. The most concerning thing for Joe is the fact that this person says, your name isn't Jonathan Moore. And in that moment, Joe knows that he has to figure out who the murderer is before the murderer figures out who he is first. Later in the day, he heads to Lady Phoebe's apartment. He has no idea what he said to her when he was really messed up, but whatever it was, it hit because Lady Phoebe is a massive fan of Jonathan Moore. He doesn't really want to visit Lady Phoebe, but she talks a lot. Maybe she can give up some information. When he gets to her apartment, though, he hears screaming. He rushes in, where he's surprised to find Lady Phoebe is perfectly fine. She's just going through laser hair removal, which is extremely painful. And Joe's actually fortunate, because when he bum rushed in, he almost got knocked out by Phoebe's bodyguard, Vic. Vic doesn't have the sunny disposition that Phoebe does. Also, Phoebe and Vic aren't the only ones there. Adam is also there, although he's on a, quote, business call, so he's a little distracted. Phoebe gets up and walks over to Joe and says, "What you said to me the other night, I don't know that I've ever been seen so completely. It's clear that something brought us together to be friends." And while Phoebe is praising whatever he said, Joe's trying to figure out exactly what it was. She then reveals to him that it was her that sent the invitation to Simon's art gallery show. While he really wants to come right out and say, okay, who wanted Malcolm dead, he knows that he can't. He has to put some breadcrumbs down. He throws Malcolm's name out there, and the impression that he gets is that Malcolm wasn't well liked, at least not to Phoebe. When Malcolm once again gets brought up, but this time in the presence of Adam, he also gives off a vibe of, yeah, Malcolm, I don't like him. They then notice that what Joe is currently wearing is not going to be good enough for an art gallery show. They need to do something about it. So they send Joe and Vic along with them to go to the art gallery and grab a suit. When they arrive, the art gallery isn't set up yet, and Joe catches a glimpse of Kate in the action. He realizes that she seems to be the only one out of this group of horrible individuals that actually works. He then keeps going down the hall, and he gets to the suite where they have the suits. In the suite, you've got Sophie and someone named Connie. He's known as the horse guy because he takes bets. You've also got Simon, although he doesn't talk to anybody. They start busting Joe's balls, and then he mentions that Phoebe was the one who sent him, and then they get quiet. And Joe files that little bit of information away in his head. Joe also decides to do with this group what he did to Phoebe, just throwing Malcolm's name out there, seeing what happens. And he gets an even more vitriolic response, especially from Simon. But it really is a collective. Connie mentions how Malcolm owes him 60 quid for horses. Kate walks in, interrupts the Malcolm bashing, and when she finds out that Joe has been invited, she's not too happy about it. But she says, hey, if Phoebe has adopted you, then good for you. But if you hurt her in any way, I'll cremate you. So, congratulations. Joe thinks that Kate is just stressed. He doesn't even consider the fact that she's just a raging bitch. With Kate distracted, though, it gives Joe an opportunity to go searching through Malcolm's things. He grabs a key to Malcolm's office out of Kate's purse, and he heads there to just see if he can find any clues on who might have wanted him dead. Other than the booze and the scotch, he does in fact find a wad full of money, which he takes as a detective fee, and a small book that was hidden away. Most of the book is filled up with horse racing odds, but at the very back there is interesting stuff. The first thing just says, Lewis, the Sun King with dagger, Thursdays, 3 p.m. The next thing says, remember, Blue Polish Hostel - ISIS. This is a prime reason why Joe hates mysteries, because he has no idea what any of this means, but he knows that it's important. As he's leaving Malcolm's office, though, he gets caught by Nadia, who is stopping by to see if he was there for office hours. Quick thinking Joe says, oh, yeah, his girlfriend wanted me to stop by and check to see if she left her wallet in here. We're neighbors. Nadia starts up a conversation about how writing a mystery novel is going, and he admits that it's not really his thing, but he's trying not to lose hope. Because of that sentence, she realizes he's falling into a lazy narrative, making the detective all about him. She tells him your detective has to have some kind of superpower. And this tip sets the light bulb off in Joe's head. Because he does have a superpower. He is very observant. So he starts to go around and observe the people that were at the dinner. Gemma and Blessing get taken off the list. They just don't fit the description. Adam is also pretty low on the list. After doing a quick Google search, Adam isn't exactly the black sheep of his family, but he's not the golden boy. That's his brother, who is a senator and looked at as possibly America's first gay president. Adam is looked at as kind of a screw-up. He's gotten DUIs before, but since getting together with Phoebe, he's seemed to clean up his act. And Sundry House is the first project that he's had that hasn't gone under before it even got off the ground. So would he screw that up for murder? Probably not. But while Joe is doing surveillance on Adam as Adam is sitting in a business meeting, he comes across an article where Adam was portraying the Sun King, and that rings a bell. He goes to that little book that he found in Malcolm's office, and he remembers, oh yeah, it said something about the Sun King and the dagger. He decides to follow Malcolm, and Malcolm goes in the back of this restaurant where Joe is a little horrified because Adam is getting peed on by one of the waiters. Hey, we don't kink shame on this YouTube channel. The reason why it said the dagger, well, the waiter that's giving the golden shower has a dagger tattoo, but Joe gets caught by Vic. Vic doesn't like how nosy Joe is, and Joe has to think quickly on his feet, so he tells him he's writing a book on the rich. This works a little bit, but what really works is when he takes the money that he found in Malcolm's office and he gives it to Vic. Later that night, he heads to the art gallery show. All the press outside, though, he doesn't want to get caught and photographed by them, so he heads to the back door, where he gets let in by somebody who looks like they work there. He now thinks that maybe Adam killed Malcolm because he found out what he was up to, and he blackmailed him. It also would work because maybe Malcolm, having run out of money with his horse gambling, needed some cash, and Adam clearly has some. He's sitting there trying to make sense of it all when Kate comes up, and she is still very cold to him. Rold and Blessing show up a few seconds later, and Rold didn't get the chance to meet Joe at Sundry House, although Joe knows exactly who he is, and he doesn't like him. He wants to get out of his presence, so he starts walking around, and that's when he runs into Adam. Adam admits to Joe that he's high on Molly. He's considering buying this egg for Phoebe. And even though Adam is high, he might be able to get some information out of him. He puts a little bit of a feeler out there regarding Malcolm, and Adam opens right up, saying, yeah, look, you might want to stay away from him. He's British, and he'll be nice, but he will shake you down. He will get all up in your business. Suddenly, Joe doesn't think Adam did do it. It wouldn't make sense for Adam to kill Malcolm and then warn him that Malcolm might blackmail him. Joe then continues to walk around, look at the art. He's not really amazed by any of it until he comes across a painting of a cat, and he is amazed by the eyes. He's not the only one. So is Rhys, who just so happens to be there. Rhys starts making fun of the people around them, and finally Joe gets to the point where he says, why are you friends with these folks? It makes no sense. Rhys chuckles and says, they were with me when I was at my lowest, so I'm loyal to them. Even to a guy like Rold. This conversation gets interrupted when that girl who let Joe in the back, she storms up and throws paint all over one of the pieces. She screamed at Simon and started cursing him out, saying, tell him what really happened. And then she's escorted out. Simon picks up the paint can, throws more paint, and acts like it's all part of the show, but it clearly wasn't. And he storms over to Kate and says, find that girl and arrest her immediately. Having seen a clue when they both walked in the door, Joe thinks he knows where he can find this girl, so he walks up to Kate and the two head over. They find her in kind of a sketchy part of town, and the girl tells them that she was an apprentice under Simon. She's the one who actually painted those cats. But what Simon did was he didn't pay her. He doped her up, making her a junkie, and refusing to actually give her credit for anything, so she ruined him. The cat in the picture was actually her aunt's cat, Isis, and Joe realizes that Malcolm was writing about her. Kate feels really bad about all this, and she cuts the girl, whose name is Blue, she cuts her a check for $3,000. Joe, though, wants to know more about why Malcolm was involved. He figures that he was going to expose Simon. So he waits for Kate to leave, and he starts chatting Blue up. She tells Joe that that was indeed the plan, to expose Simon, but all of a sudden Malcolm stopped returning the calls, vanished, so there went that plan, and she felt like she had to do it herself. Because of this, Joe is now convinced that Simon was the one who murdered Malcolm. And when he walks outside to the car, he tries to warn Kate, but Kate tells him to piss off. She's not sure who he is or what his endgame with all of this is, but what she knows is she doesn't trust him. She's not very nice about it either. She reminds him that he's a hollow nobody with no life of his own. Kate then drives back separately, and it leaves Joe to have to get there on his own. But he eventually does, sitting outside and waiting for Simon to walk out so he can put all of this to an end. It's late, though. Joe kind of dozes off, and he's awoken when he hears police sirens. That's because Simon was killed. Whoever's doing this decided to take Simon out that night in the art gallery show. The next day, Joe decides to head on over to Lady Phoebe's house where they're having a quasi-wake, although no one seems all that upset about what happened. The truth is, all of them seem kind of guilty if you're looking for it. He does find out, though, that one of the things that happened to Simon was they cut off his ear. And after Malcolm getting his pinky cut off, it's clearly a trend with whoever this killer is. Adam actually brings up a really good point, that this is going to be beneficial to Kate. Simon wasn't very nice to Kate, and his parting gift for dying is the fact that his art just skyrocketed in price. It's going to make Kate a lot of money. also kind of makes Kate a suspect in a way. He heads back to the apartment, and he sees Kate. She's on the phone, and she's talking to Blue. Turns out that Kate got Blue in a rehab. While she puts off this tough exterior, Joe can't figure out why she acts like she doesn't care about her and then foots the bill for a rehab center. But it seems like Kate is also interested in getting her art into the gallery. Joe is stuck. He needs a little bit more help, and he heads back to the library to check out more Agatha Christie, and that's when he runs into Nadia. Malcolm comes up in conversation, but it's Nadia who brings him up. Nadia had given Malcolm some of her pages to read. She wanted some feedback, and she was really upset when Malcolm just blew her off, never answering, because Nadia doesn't realize that Malcolm's dead. But because of how upset she is, it makes Joe think that maybe there was more to this Nadia and Malcolm story. Either way, he volunteers to help her out with the pages. It's something that Nadia really, really appreciates. After checking out the books, he heads home, and it's his worst nightmare waiting for him. Somebody broke into his apartment, printed out all of the news stories of everyone he's ever killed, and put them on his wall. Then he gets a message that says, "I found you. Hello, Joe." In episode 3, Joe frantically takes down every one of those articles that's on his wall and throws them in the trash. All the while, he's getting text messages from this mystery person asking, "Am I right? Are all those articles about you?" At first, Joe denies it, but eventually he realizes, I just got to start ignoring this person for the time being. The next day, he goes to his class and he starts teaching, ironically, a story about a stalker who seems to be obsessed with their victim. As the class is arguing the meaning of this, word gets out that Malcolm's finger was found. It was actually sent to the police by whoever killed him. And the note said, "This is not a kidnapping, this is a murder." Joe now knows that whoever this person is, they didn't keep the pinky as a trophy. They kept it to force him to play this game. He reaches out to the person and says, "What do you want?" And they say, "Admit you're Joe Goldberg." He simply writes, "I'm not, but if I was, what would you want from me?" And they send back, "For starters, why'd you kill all those people? By the way, I should mention, I still have Simon's ear. Shall I send with a note signed Jonathan Moore?" Joe's panicking a little bit at this point, and he texts back, "If I had done those things, they could have only been because I had no other option." He then overhears one of his students, Edward, gossiping with a few other students. Edward's dad works in the newspaper, so he gets some inside information. That's one of the reasons why so many students are asking him about the situation. But when Nadia hears them joking about it, she storms up and yells at them for joking about someone dying. She's way more invested in this than a student normally would be about their teacher being murdered. It seems like a personal connection with her. Joe doesn't have time, though, to intervene. He has to find out who this mystery murderer is. As he eagerly awaits this person to send him another text message, he notices that Kate is talking to the police. He then gets caught by her, staring at her from his window. And she decides to send the police over to him because, after all, he was the last person to see Malcolm alive. As we know at this point, Joe is very, very good at this sort of thing. He plays himself off as innocent, and the police buy his story. He also points the finger at somebody else. He brings up the fact that Malcolm told him he found out Simon was stealing art. He makes it sound like Malcolm was ready to blackmail Simon because of this. And he gives the police Blue's name in order to corroborate the story. Once the police do leave, he gets a message from the murderer. They make a comment about how Kate sent the police right to him. And he immediately goes over to his window because he knows the person must be close, but he doesn't see anything. He then gets a follow-up message that says Kate's a threat. Life or death, one might say. You should take care of her. And now Joe thinks that the next target might be Kate, and he goes into protective mode. He puts on his jacket and heads over to her apartment, and he's surprised because Nadia is standing outside. They do the awkward, "What are you doing here?" And Nadia fesses up to having slept with Malcolm. She went to the apartment because she tried to sneak in. She wrote him a letter, and she wants it back. She doesn't want it found. It's got a lot of personal information in there. Joe doesn't judge her for any of this, just telling her, "I know Kate a little bit. I can get your letter for you, don't worry." After sending Nadia on her way, Joe heads to the funeral services for Simon. There's a lot of paparazzi outside this thing. And Joe is really the only person that they don't recognize who doesn't seem to belong. The paparazzi aren't the only ones that feel this way. Kate also wants to know why he's there. She storms up to him in the church and demands to know what he's doing there, and he says, "I was invited by Phoebe." What he's really doing there, though, is trying to figure out which one of these people is actually the murderer. The more he looks around the room, though, the more he realizes it could be any of them. They all fit the description in one way or the other. He continues doing his reconnaissance at the luncheon when he's approached by Vic. Vic makes it known that he does not trust him. He finds everything about Joe super shady. So now on top of the murderer, Joe's got to deal with this guy. A short while later, the luncheon wraps up. Joe heads out, and he sees Kate waiting for an Uber and decides to chat her up, saying, I'm sorry, we seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot. But Kate is still super cold to Joe. She also has no interest in talking to him, so she stops waiting for the car and just decides to walk home. And Joe follows her. He follows her all the way to a pub where he decides to go in and sit next to her. He once again apologizes to her, trying to smooth things over with her, but she's the ice queen. He hints at the fact that this must be a tough time for her because any one of her friends could be the killer, but she hasn't even thought about that. She thinks that it could be any one of the thousands of people that would love to see rich people die. The conversation continues to get hostile until all of a sudden it just turns on a dime. Kate goes from not wanting to talk to Joe at all to revealing that when she was a little girl, her mother suppressed her emotions. It's probably why she's so cold. She then wants to show Joe something, which he finds incredibly ironic because she was just yelling at him for, quote, stalking her. She leads him all the way to a secret garden, and that's where she comes onto him. Because your boyfriend getting murdered and his pinky getting sent to the police is nature's most powerful aphrodisiac. While Joe knows that he shouldn't, he gives in anyway. Him and Kate hook up right then and there in the secret garden, but they're not alone. Because Vic was following them, and Vic was watching all of this. Joe goes home with Kate that night and actually sleeps over her apartment. He wakes up before she does, and that's when he goes into detective mode trying to find Nadia's letter. He does find it, but he gets caught by Kate. It forces him to come clean about the reason he's snooping around, although he never uses Nadia's real name. None of this comes as a surprise to Kate. She knew that Malcolm was cheating on her. What Kate's more upset about is the fact that she feels used, like Joe came home with her just to find this letter, so she kicks him out. But Joe continues to keep a close eye on her apartment. As he's doing this, he gets a message from the murderer that says, I've been watching you, quote, protect her. I figured you out. I think you kill to protect the things you love. Kate's not love yet, but she did help me see your pattern. You like it, how it feels to kill. Joe texts the person back saying, you're insane. And they respond saying, I'll show you. He then hears Kate leave and he follows her, all the way to Malcolm's family crypt. She starts talking to Malcolm, or the empty crypt that he will be in once they find the body, and Joe, all the while, is watching this from afar. But once Kate leaves, Joe is caught by Vic, who has him at gunpoint. Vic starts frisking Joe, looking for anything he can find because he wants to know what Joe is up to. And what he thinks is Joe is the murderer and Kate is the next victim. Joe tries to tell Vic that that's not the case, but then Vic finds something. It was Malcolm's pinky ring, and Joe literally has no idea how it got in his possession. He starts quickly thinking about how he could have gotten in possession of it, and there was a guy that bumped into him at the funeral. There was a group of girls that he passed by, but honestly, it could have been anything. This pinky ring, though, is trouble. He's got to silence Vic, and the two start getting into a fight where Joe prevails, ultimately killing him. Even though he proved this person right by killing again, he also proved them wrong because he didn't get off on it. He hated it. He now has to dispose the body, which he does. He writes Phoebe a letter as Vic saying that he's resigning from the job, and then he heads home. As soon as he sits down on his couch, he gets a text message from the person saying, I was right. You liked it, didn't you? And he screams at the phone, no, I didn't. But then he gets an idea. This person might actually want to team up with Joe. They might be lonely. So go along with it. He texts the person back. It was exhilarating. And what he's hoping is this person wants to meet him in real life. The person doesn't respond. And the next day when he wakes up, he's still waiting for a response, while also keeping tabs on Kate to make sure she's safe. He watches her rip out a Malcolm portrait and burn it in her apartment. While it's burning, she looks up and she sees that Joe is watching. He hears his phone buzz, but it's not the murderer. It's actually Phoebe. She needs to meet him at Sundry House ASAP. And when he goes to leave, he can't because he gets a knock at the door and it's Nadia. He gives her the letter that he found, reassuring her that he didn't read it. And then they have a quick conversation about relationships, death, the grieving process, all that. Once Nadia leaves, he feels his phone buzz again, and this time it is the murderer. And his trap has worked. They message him saying, I think it's time for us to meet. And he responds on one condition. Leave Kate alone. She's mine. He then heads off to Sundry House where he's surprised because everybody's there. And everybody is staring at him, arms crossed, looking accusatory. And that's when the police show up saying, can we talk to you for a moment? and now he's definitely concerned. In episode 4, Joe's initial nervousness about the fact that he has all these people staring at him with pretty accusatory glances and the cops wanting to talk to him is washed away. Turns out they just wanted to circle back and they were questioning everybody. After the murder to Simon, they're looking at everybody. London now is dubbing this the kill the rich murderer. Joe doesn't really have anything to add to the police report that he can think of, and the police just tell him, hey, call us if you do think of anything. After Joe is questioned by the police, Phoebe pulls him aside and says, we're all going to a place called Hampstead, which is Phoebe's country house. They're trying to get away from it all. With a killer on the loose, they don't want to be the next victim, so they're all hunkering down in a house together. Adam's actually running away from 2 things, the killer and also creditors. He owes a lot of money to a lot of people, but he just figures that his dad will eventually bail him out, even though his dad said he won't. He's done. She invites Joe, and while he really doesn't want to go, he also needs to keep tabs on what's going on to try to figure out who is texting him. He knows it's one of these people, so he reluctantly heads to Hampstead. When he gets there, the place is gorgeous. It looks like a house out of Bridgerton, which there's a recap for that. I'll put the tab up. There's waitstaff, there's security, and there's also nosy people. Like Gemma, who walks right up to Joe and asks, is Phoebe actually shagging you, or are you just decorative? Also, is it true American men are better in bed? All of this takes Joe completely off guard. He doesn't quite know what to say. But after talking to Gemma for a couple of minutes, he's relatively certain that she's not the killer. She's just too dumb. Everybody then walks into the house, gets their room assignment, and Joe finds out that there is no service at this place. He starts thinking about it and realizes that this house is from another world. No security cameras, no service. It's kind of a killer's dream in a way. He then gets a visit from his next-door neighbor, who just so happens to be Kate. She tells him that the room that he's currently staying in isn't just assigned to anyone, so he must have done something right with Phoebe. She came, though, because she wanted to set some ground rules about the fact that they will not be hooking up this weekend. She says it, though, in a way that makes you think they absolutely will be hooking up that weekend. Kate leaves the room, and as Joe is sitting there contemplating his next move, somebody slides a note under the door for Joe to meet them in the portrait gallery. Joe thinks that this must be the murderer. He's come prepared. He's brought some piano wire just in case he does encounter this psychopath. But when he gets to the portrait room, he's pretty surprised because this place is an absolute sex den. That note wasn't given to him by a killer. That note was slid under his door by Phoebe, who is looking damn good and is ready for Joe to murder that ass. Joe, however, turns her down, and that really hurts Phoebe, but the way that Joe looks at it, Phoebe, you've already got somebody. You've got Adam. That was something that Phoebe was a little self-conscious of, so Joe takes it upon himself to reassure Phoebe that Adam really does care for her. He even brings up the fact that he was married once, but he lies to Phoebe, saying that even though this woman was his everything, he had other things on his mind, and that probably hurt her. Joe is able to get out of this sex den, still remaining friends with Phoebe and not sleeping with her. After this close encounter with the hottest person on the show, Joe wanders the grounds looking for any sign of cell reception, but he's coming up empty. Also, the more he spends time with these people, the more that he grows to loathe them. Especially Gemma. She is completely demeaning to the staff. As he's witnessing this firsthand, Adam walks up to him and says, hey, let's get a drink. I think it's time we get to know each other. They go inside, just the two of them, and Joe starts wondering if this could be the killer, Adam. Adam is not, though. He heard from Phoebe that Joe was married once, and Adam needs some advice. He's thinking of proposing to Phoebe, and he wants to know if getting married changed all of it. He's worried because if he gets married, he won't be able to have his secrets anymore. Through talking to him, though, Adam reveals that he's not really marrying for love. He'd be marrying because his life would get easier. Marrying Phoebe would finally give him the money that he needs to be a little bit more successful and not rely on his dad. Joe tries to give him advice, but Adam really doesn't listen to it all that much. At the end of the conversation, Adam thinks he has answers, but he doesn't. He does thank Joe for the therapy session, and Joe says, it's always nice to get out of the city. I do appreciate Phoebe inviting me. And Adam says, this wasn't Phoebe's idea, it was Rold's. Joe starts wondering why Rold would want him in attendance. The guy who is so eager to hunt and has a collection of knives, wanting him there, it's puzzling. Joe heads back to his room, but he inadvertently walks into a conversation with Kate and some security guards. She's ripping into these security guards, telling him that she doesn't care what his orders are, she wants them gone. When Kate sees that Joe was watching the conversation, she approaches him and says, I don't like spies. He apologizes, but the sexual tension is way too much, and the two start to hook up in the room, but they stop themselves. Kate heads out, but Joe sees that she heads right into a conversation with Rold. The two are pretty damn flirtatious with each other. It's got Joe thinking that maybe Kate could be his in with Rold. He heads to her room after the two are done talking, and he asks, "Hey, you and Rold seem like you're friends. It also seems like he hates me. I was hoping you had some tips on how to change that." She explains that with Rold, when he meets new people, he tries to be the alpha, especially if it's people he deems less than worthy, aka broke. Joe points out that kind of fits Kate's description. She's not rich. Yeah, she's a huge success, but she's not heir to some fortune, at least not one that Joe knows about. So to these people, she is practically poor. Kate says, "Yeah, we go so far back, I guess he just forgot about that." Joe leaves the room with a new theory. Rold loves Kate. Kate's with Malcolm. Malcolm winds up dead. Simon's behavior threatens Kate's career, so he kills Simon. All of the signs are now pointing to Rold. He can't just go on a theory, though. He needs concrete evidence. He heads to Rold's room and starts snooping around for anything that would point to Rold being the killer. He looks around the room and he's coming up empty, so he decides to check Rold's camera. At first, it's nothing out of the ordinary, but then it's creepy upskirt shots of Kate. He doesn't understand why Rold would be the killer, be obsessed with Kate, but also threaten to kill her at the same time, unless it was an empty threat. He hears people coming upstairs, so he has to get out of the room, and it was a good idea because it's Rold and Kate. A couple hours later, Joe heads downstairs and joins everybody else for dinner. Gemma's behavior is horrible. Even Kate voices her displeasure with it. She tells Joe that Gemma was fine in college, but she just hasn't grown up since then. Kate gets up to excuse herself, and Rold chases after her. He asks her if she wants to hang out, but she says, "No, my day's filled up." And Joe catches a sign of disgust from Rold. He's not happy about it. He also did not expect anyone to be looking at the conversation. So when Joe gets up, he invites him to go hunting the next day. Just the two of them to, quote, get to know each other better. When they do get out in the woods, it's an uncomfortable conversation. Rold is completely trying to alpha male Joe. He also gives a little bit of backstory on to Kate, the kid. Kate's mother slit her wrist over some guy, and Kate was sent off. Even at a young age, Kate seemed to have to be the mother. That's why she never shed a tear, and always seemed to look for the next disaster to save. But he's telling Joe all of this because he finishes it off by saying, "Yeah, at any rate, I've always looked out for her." And Malcolm was definitely not appropriate for a woman like her. He was a taker, and a liar, and a joke. There's a lot of malice in his voice as Rold is saying this. When Simon gets brought up in conversation, Rold goes off on him too, saying that Kate incorrectly thought he was a genius, but that was a black hole of energy. As Rold is talking, he's also slowly getting behind Joe, holding a gun. It seems like he might actually shoot Joe in the back until a gunshot goes off, and it's Kate, who decided to join them in the hunt, and might have just saved Joe's life. She instructs Joe to go up ahead. Her and Rold will catch up later. On the way back to the house, she rips into Rold for finding somebody new to bully. It sparks a bit of a fight between the two, with Kate reminding Rold that she is nothing like him. A little while later, everybody has to get ready for a fancy dinner. Joe heads over to Kate's room so she can help him with his cufflinks. She helps him with a lot more than that, though. The two finally end up hooking up, for good this time. After they clean themselves up, they head down to dinner, and it's like the other night. These people are just insufferably annoying, especially Gemma. There's a little bit of a lull in the conversation, and Rold points his attention to Joe, saying, I do wonder, do poor people like you harbor resentment to people like us, the successful ones, the rich ones? Joe doesn't take the bait, though, telling Rold that he's happy with his life. Gemma chimes in, hypothesizing that what if Joe were the killer? I mean, people started dying when he popped up. Now, she's saying this in a joking manner, and everybody is laughing about it, but it's making Joe extremely uncomfortable. Kate comes to Joe's defense, telling Gemma to shut up, and Rold goes, I find that really interesting. The one coming to the poor professor's defense is actually the richest one of us all. I mean, you must have had some amnesia because you truly believe you're not one of us. Joe is really confused on all this. Rold can sense it, and he looks at Kate and says, oh, come on, tell me he knows. But Joe has no idea what Rold is talking about. This really uncomfortable conversation is broken up by one of the butlers who comes in and announces to the group that Lady Phoebe is dead. She's not actually dead, though. It's all part of a game, and they're to find her killer. As the group plays Find the Killer, Joe is actually trying to find the real killer. He has no interest in playing this game with them, but neither does Kate. He sees her alone and he walks up to her, and she comes clean about what Roll was talking about. Her father is extremely wealthy. He's actually one of the more powerful men on the planet. But his moral compass is non-existent. He doesn't care who he hurts as long as it makes him money. The security that's walking around, it's actually from her dad. That's why she wants them to go away. She doesn't want her dad having any hand in her life whatsoever. She's set off to be something more than her dad's daughter. But the way that dinner just went down, she thinks that she'll never be anything more than just that. Joe gives her a little bit of a pep talk, telling her that her past and where she comes from does not define her. It's up to her. She can be the person she wants to be. It's in this moment, though, that he realizes it's happening again. He's falling for Kate. Just like he fell for Marianne, just like he fell for Love, just like he fell for Beck. They get forced, though, to rejoin the game. So Joe takes it as an opportunity to go through Rold's room again. He's caught, though, by Rold, who actually throws Joe out of a window. As Joe is trying to get to his feet, he hears a scream come from the house. Although the commotion, he feels like nobody else heard it but him, so he rushes in, fearing that it was Kate. It's not Kate, though. He goes to her room, and Kate is there, but she's staring at the dead body of Gemma, who was stabbed. And Kate looks to be holding the murder weapon. In the season finale, Joe now thinks that it was Kate who did this. It makes sense. He fell for a killer before, but it wasn't. Kate just walked in the room and saw the body there. It takes a little bit of convincing, but Kate is able to convince Joe that it wasn't her. Kate also doesn't want to call for help. If she does that, it involves security, which involves her father. She doesn't want her father having any leverage over her. They're going to have to take care of this body, and they're going to have to do it together. As the rest of everybody is partying downstairs, Joe and Kate put Gemma's body into a trunk and start cleaning up. They do get an unwelcome guest from Phoebe, who actually takes a seat on the trunk that has Gemma's body in it. And she came because she caught Adam with a servant, a male servant. And honestly, she doesn't really care about all that. The gender, the cheating. It was the way that Adam was looking at this guy. That's what bothers Phoebe. Joe knows that he needs to get Phoebe out of the room, so he speeds up this talk. He tells Phoebe that maybe Adam is into some things that he's embarrassed about. A talk between the two might clear all of this up. Phoebe wants Joe to elaborate a little bit more. And Kate turns to her and says, "Phoebe, you gotta leave so me and Joe can hook up." That's all that Phoebe needed to hear, and she heads out. And Joe and Kate continue to get rid of Gemma's body. They're able to sneak it out to the stables without being detected. But Kate starts to wonder how Joe is so good at hiding bodies and demands some answers. She starts yelling at Joe, "Did you kill Gemma and now your plan is to kill me too?" Joe pleads his innocence. Kate, though, isn't really believing it, and Joe says, "The same thing that happened to you and Gemma happened to me with Malcolm's body. I woke up and there he was. I'm really sorry I got scared, and I knew that nobody would believe I didn't do it, so I had to take care of his body. But as soon as it happened to me, I started getting texts from whoever actually did do it. Make sure that I would cooperate. They did this to ensure my continued silence because they figured out that I had a past. I used to be married to a woman who was rich and did very bad things. I had to get away from this woman. I had to get away from her family, and in the end, I ran away. And it cost me my son." That revelation takes Kate back a bit. He continues on saying that he figured if he stayed close to Kate and her friends, he might be able to figure out who this killer is and keep her friends safe. But apparently he's not doing a good job at it. After Joe is done talking, Kate believes his story and believes that he's innocent. After they're done cleaning up the body, they get back in the house, and Kate realizes she doesn't have her bracelet on, the same bracelet that has her name engraved on it. She starts panicking, thinking that it might be with Gemma's body. Joe reassures her that he'll go find the bracelet, and he sends Kate back to her room. But it looks like when she gets back to her room that her room has been broken into. She hesitantly enters the room, and there's Phoebe, looking at a giant blood-stained rug. Phoebe had returned to the room to have a conversation with Kate. She approached Adam about his kink. They went through it, but Adam just couldn't get into being peed on by Phoebe like he did with guys. It was a status thing. And because of this, Phoebe broke up with Adam. She wanted some advice from her best friend, but now she's looking at this bloodstained rug. Kate has to come clean to Phoebe, and Phoebe doesn't get weirded out by this at all. She's actually more relieved that it wasn't Kate who was murdered. Phoebe wants to go warn everybody else, but Kate says, "No, don't. We will handle this because we can handle it. But what you need to do is send the staff away. We need privacy. We don't want anyone else getting hurt, and we need privacy to deal with this body. Phoebe's fine with sending people away, but she's not fine with keeping people in the dark. She has to tell people that Gemma got killed. So Kate reluctantly says, okay, we'll tell everybody together. Their entire conversation, though, was being eavesdropped on by Rold. So Rold knows that Gemma is dead, he knows where the body is, and more importantly, he knows that Joe is with the body trying to find Kate's bracelet. So he sneaks down there with a gun, and as Joe has located the bracelet, he points it at Joe's head. Unlike Kate, Rold is convinced that Joe is the murderer. He forces Joe back inside and places him in front of everybody, proclaiming to the group, I found the Eat the Rich killer. Joe's concerned, but he also knows that these people have been drinking and are on drugs, and they've been doing it all night. So this could go in a number of ways. The first reaction, though, is no one believes Rold. They think it's a joke. Rold assures the group, though, that he is serious. Joe was with Gemma's body. Kate and Phoebe already know, and all of it makes sense. Joe silenced Gemma after she brought up the point that he was the killer. At these accusations, Joe points the proverbial gun at Rold, saying, well, what about you? You hated Malcolm. And by the way, why don't you show everybody your camera? All your creepy little photos of Kate, you're obsessed with her. Unfortunately for Joe, he doesn't have a lot of people on his side. Adam is especially pissed off at Joe because he looks at Joe as a guy who ruined his relationship with Phoebe. Rold is pretty convincing with the group, especially when he pulls out Kate's bloody bracelet. And the only thing Joe can say for himself is ask Kate. She found Gemma's body. She knows the truth. Rold wants to kill Joe, but he also wants to let him run away. He likes a good hunt. So Joe takes off running, and a little while later, Rold runs after him. Shortly after the two have left the house in a chase, Kate and Phoebe come down and clear up the entire thing for everybody remaining, that it wasn't Joe who killed Gemma. When Kate hears that Rold took a gun out to go kill Joe, she sends her father's men after him, saying, go protect him. Make sure nobody else dies. Meanwhile, Joe's doing a pretty good job of evading Rold. He's able to hide behind a tree and get the jump on him, tackling him. He grabs his head, slams against the ground, and knocks Rold out. But that's when somebody walks over and grabs Rold's gun. And to Joe's shock, it's Rhys, the one guy in the group who didn't attend the weekend. He stands over Joe's body and says, hello, Joe, and then smashes him in the head with the gun, knocking him out. He drags both Joe and Rold to an abandoned part of the house and chains them up. The place kind of looks like a dungeon, and Rhys assures Joe that he can scream all he wants, the place is soundproof, no one's going to hear him. Rhys can tell that Joe is shocked to learn that it was him the whole time, and he says, look, if I were you, I would have questions too. I wasn't really ready for this face-to-face, but then you got yourself into a bind, and it was clear that if I didn't intervene, you were going to get yourself killed. He then gets down low and tells Joe about his master plan. They're going to pin all the murders on Rold. Rhys reveals that he's learned a lot from Joe and how he's handled previous situations like this one. But the biggest thing he's learned from Joe is pin all of it on a dead person so they can't protest their innocence. The thing is, Rold isn't dead yet. And when Joe points that out, Rhys says, oh yeah, I know, you're going to kill him. You're going to take care of that, I'm going to take care of everything else. Nobody's going to be surprised that Rold was the killer. Right before Rhys leaves, he tells Joe, just be done by the time I get back. And he never unchains Joe. Once Rhys does leave, Joe starts looking around his surroundings to see if he can get out of this mess. He's also trying to process the fact that it was Rhys the whole time, a complete surprise to him. He knows that Rold does deserve to die, but he also knows that that's what Rhys wants, and he doesn't want to satisfy that psychopath. Because of that, Joe has to escape, and he's also planning on saving Rold to spite Rhys. No matter how hard he tries, though, Joe cannot escape, and when Rhys comes back, Rold is still alive, although knocked out, and Joe is still chained up. Joe begs Rhys to let his hands go free, but Rhys says no. You know, it's just a shame. Clearly, you're not the man I thought you were. My plan A, before I knew who you were, was to frame you for Malcolm's murder. Maybe I'll have to go back to that. If you're clever enough to get yourself free, we can meet back in London in a week and we can revisit it. Otherwise, goodbye, Joe. And then he kicks over a lantern, which sparks a fire. Inside, all of the rest of the people start seeing smoke, and they start getting concerned. The place is going up pretty fast, and Joe is frantically trying to get free. The fire and the smoke have actually woken Rold up, although he has more questions than actually plans to help out. It takes a bit, but Joe is able to free himself. And even though he really doesn't want to, he ends up freeing Roald as well. In the wee hours of the morning, everybody watches as Hampseat goes up in flames. By the time he returns to London, the news has gotten wind of what happened, and they're pinning it on the Eat the Rich killer. The group did apologize to him, but it was pretty half-assed. While he's not happy about how things turned out, he does think about the positive side. At least they know he's innocent at this point. Since returning, though, he hasn't heard anything from Rhys. As he's watching the news, he gets a knock at the door, and it's Kate. She feels bad about all his things burning up in the fire, so she's brought him some of Malcolm's things that he never wore. She also came over to thank him for everything. She asks him if it's okay if she buys him a pint, and while Joe would love to, he knows that that pint means a date. And he doesn't want to go down that road because Kate knows a little too much about him at this point. When Joe turns her down, Kate's a little surprised about this. But Joe says, "I don't want to hurt you. I'm sorry. I can't." Kate doesn't handle it well, curses him out, and goes back to her place. Joe walks back inside his apartment, and he's surprised because there's Rhys on the TV. He's doing an exclusive interview where he's breaking down the tragedy of all the deaths at the hands of the Eat the Rich killer. Rhys says this is a part of a larger problem with London, and that is why he is announcing his run for mayor. In episode 6, Joe dives into Rhys Montrose, trying to find out all he can to exploit any cracks that he might find. Unfortunately, though, he doesn't find any. He also hates the fact that because of Rhys, he had to push Kate away. Kate has an event coming up at Sundry House, but she didn't invite Joe. Joe would have absolutely gotten an email had he not pushed her away. He actually overhears about the event when he opens up his door, and he overhears Kate and Roald discussing it. Roald won't be able to make the event because he's going away for a little bit. Lucky for Joe, though, he does end up getting an invite from Lady Phoebe. Lady Phoebe is planning on being in attendance, but she's going through a really difficult time. She has a little bit of PTSD from the Hampseat fire, but more importantly, she thinks she's being followed. She tells Adam this because the two had gotten back together, but Adam figures that it's just nothing more than her fans. Phoebe, though, is way more concerned. Adam tries to set her mind at ease and tells her to get ready for the party and have fun. Before Joe can head off to this party, he dives even more into researching Rhys. He knows he has to find some way to get to him. The problem is he always has somebody around him. He's either in public, has security. It's really, really difficult. As he's doing a little bit of research in the school library, Nadia comes up and interrupts him a little bit. She notices that Joe is listening to Rhys's podcast, and she mentions how one of her friends had seen him doing a jog around a park one morning. That could be the opening that Joe needs. He heads home from the library and wants to dive more into attacking Rhys at the park, much like he attacked Peach. But when he gets home, he's not alone because Rhys has broken in. He's sitting there waiting for Joe. Joe is very taken aback, but he does get some information on why Rhys killed who he killed. He killed Malcolm because he was blackmailing Rhys regarding his gambling habit. Simon's exploitation of women was about to leak, and he would have been associated with it. Gemma was a drunken mistake that he made while he was married, and it was only a matter of time before she opened her big mouth. They all had to go. But now he needs the Eat the Rich story to go away. It's not good for his campaign. He didn't come here to chit-chat with Joe. He came here to give him an ultimatum. You have to go find somebody to pin this on. And if you don't, it's all going to be pinned on you. This gives Joe a whole lot to think about when he heads to Sundry House. He walks in, he sees Kate, but she ignores him. First person he actually talks to is Phoebe. She confides in Joe that she feels like she's being stalked. Joe uses this to his advantage, trying to find out from Phoebe which one of her friends would be more likely to be a killer so he can tag them with the murders. The person he comes up with is Connie. Phoebe tells Joe that Connie is already a suspect in the murders because he didn't have an alibi. While Phoebe doesn't think that Connie could have actually done it, for Joe and Rhys, it doesn't matter. He's a mark. As he's talking to Phoebe, though, he looks to his right and he sees Kate with another guy, very handsy, very friendly. The guy's name is Nico. He's a bachelor and the heir to a shipping fortune. Phoebe has no idea what he's doing in London, and Joe doesn't care. What he does care about is he's really friendly with Kate, and it's pretty clear that the two do have a past. Joe tries to remind himself that Kate is a free woman, but it still irks the hell out of him. What Joe doesn't know is Nico is there to catch up with Kate. He tells Kate that he no longer works for his dad. Since he knows that she doesn't use the Lockwood name, he felt like there would be a connection. He's able to schmooze this connection into a private showing for Simon's art later that night. He'll be able to see the exhibit before anybody else. He'll also be able to purchase the art before anybody else, which is a pretty big deal. That night, Nico and Kate meet up, and Nico makes a substantial offer for all of the art before the exhibit even opens. The next day is the day of the actual exhibit opening, though. Before Joe goes, he meets with Connie. He was honestly surprised that Connie agreed to meet with him. But the more he talks to Connie, the more he feels bad for him. Connie shows up with a broken nose, looking like a dog who got in the trash. He knows that he's messed up time and time again. He knows that the cops are after him because he doesn't have an alibi. He also knows that he isn't capable of doing those things. The way that Joe can justify this to himself is that if he does frame Connie for murder, Connie will be forced to get clean. Maybe change his life for the better. As he's looking at Connie in such a sad state, he gets a text message from Rhys telling him to go back to his house, look in the freezer once he finds someone to pin this on. When Joe eventually does go home and look in the freezer, it's Simon's ear, sitting there waiting. That will be the item that they'll use to pin the murderers on whoever. Rhys also tells him that he has to do it tonight or the murderers are on him. So that night, Joe is planning on pinning the murders on Connie. He knows that Connie will be at the art exhibit, so that's where he heads. With the ear securely in his pocket, he starts looking around for Connie. But the person who grabs his ear first is Adam. Adam apologizes for everything that went down in Hampstead, but he also needs something from Joe. Adam is planning on proposing to Phoebe, and he needs a good word. He knows that Phoebe values Joe's opinion, so he says to him, "Hey, when you see her, can you just put in a good word?" The thing that Joe and Phoebe don't know is Adam isn't doing this because of love. He was trying to sell his car collection to a buyer, and the buyer knew how cash-strapped that Adam was. He also knew who he was dating and knew that there was an out. He knew that if Adam married Phoebe, his financial woes are gone. So he gave him an option. He told Adam, "I'll give you a diamond ring to propose with, and if she says yes, then great. But if she doesn't, I get all of your cars for free." Adam, by the way, is planning on proposing the next day. As soon as Adam leaves Joe's company, Joe sees two familiar faces that he wasn't expecting to see today, Nadia and Edward, the two kids that hated each other in class. Edward's mom got them an invite. She wanted him to be more cultured, and Nadia realized that he wasn't all that bad. They both, though, do the "what are you doing here?" because Nadia knows that Joe isn't rich. She is completely floored, though, when he mentions how he has friends there, and one of those friends is Phoebe. Nadia is starstruck when she sees her. Joe tells her to walk over, grab a selfie, but he wants to get out of the conversation because he wants to find Connie. He turns the corner, though, and he doesn't find Connie. He runs into Kate. They're face-to-face. They're kind of forced to talk, and Joe starts complimenting Kate on the event. And Kate says, "You do realize you're giving mixed signals right now. You say you don't want to pursue anything, and then you come to my event." She tells him that he has to figure out what he actually wants, and then she walks away. That is when Joe sees Connie. He looks like he's passed out in the corner already. Joe feels like this is perfect. He's just sneak over, put the ear in his pocket, and done. But when he tries to, Connie wakes up. He's actually excited to see Joe because he's excited to tell him that he checked himself into rehab. He can't wait to start his new life, the clean and sober life. Even after this, Joe considers pinning the murders on Connie, but he can't bring himself to do it. He walks away from Connie and hears everybody clapping. He asks Blessing what's going on, and she tells him that Nico bought all of the art, which is a huge donation to Kate's foundation. As Joe is trying to eavesdrop on Kate and Nico's conversation, Nadia runs up and asks, "Hey, is everything okay? I just asked Lady Phoebe for a selfie and she was dragged out by some really rude waitress. Apparently the police need to speak to her?" This is the first that Joe is hearing about this, and he starts to panic a little bit. The police are there, but when he gets the group together and asks the police for some details, they have no idea what Joe or Nadia are talking about. They do a quick radio call, and nobody from the police department escorted Lady Phoebe out. All hope isn't lost. They know she couldn't have gotten far. They took an elevator downstairs. Sundry House has a bunch of hotel rooms in it, so they're probably in one of those. But Lady Phoebe is in danger. The woman who escorted her down told her that the police need to speak to her privately alone, but this woman is a stalker. She had posed before as a photographer, but she is a super fan of Phoebe. She felt like with the police not doing their job catching the Eat the Rich killer, she had to take matters into her own hands and protect her sister. At least that's what she calls Phoebe. They're not related. After what Phoebe told Joe earlier in the day, he figures that this might be related. Because of Joe's background in this sort of thing, he's able to locate Phoebe pretty quickly. While the woman had locked the door, both Phoebe and Joe convince her to open it, and that's when they're able to overpower her. It's actually Phoebe who takes the knife away from her and yells at her. A few seconds after Phoebe does take the knife away, the cops come down, and they happen to find the ear that Joe planted on the woman. Now they have their mark for the Eat the Rich killer. Adam comes running down to make sure that Phoebe's okay, but this kidnapping wasn't a total loss. The woman told Phoebe that Adam was using her. He was completely broke, and that's why the staff was walking out. So Phoebe now feels like she's been lied to by her boyfriend. Because of that, Adam's the last person she really wants to see. With the police escorting the woman out, Phoebe looks at Joe and says, "You're the hero, again." And Nadia overhears that. Because curiosity got the best of her, she followed everybody downstairs, and she finds that comment really interesting. She starts to think that there's something off with Joe, like he knows more than he's letting on. And she's definitely going to keep her eye on him. The next day, right after his girlfriend was kidnapped, Adam decides this will be a great day to propose, but she said no. After finding out about all his financial troubles, she wants him to get his affairs in order before he makes such a commitment. While that relationship is on the rocks, there's another relationship that seems to be blooming. Joe looks over and sees Kate and Nico about to hook up in Kate's apartment, but then they stop. And Joe can sense that they're fighting. They're fighting because as Kate was starting to hook up with Nico, she looked down and saw that Nico got a text message from her father. She realizes that Nico is now working for her dad. She feels completely betrayed by Nico. She no longer wants to sell him any of the art. And while Nico pleads his case, she kicks him out. That's the opening that Joe needed. He waits a little bit of time and then heads over to Kate's apartment. It takes a whole lot of words, but he basically tells her, "I want you." And the two end up hooking up that night. When he gets back to his apartment, sex, hair, and all, he is pissed. Not because of the sex, that was cool, but because Rhys Montrose is sitting in his apartment with a crap-eating grin on his face. The frustration level for Joe is reaching a boiling point. He sits down and says, "Okay, Rhys, what now? This is over, right?" And Rhys laughs and says, "Over? I mean, we're done dealing with the little people, if that's what you mean." There is one last thing. You'll love it. It's Kate's father. We're going to have so much fun killing him. Episode 7 picks up right where Episode 6 left off. Joe has no interest in killing Kate's father, even though Kate absolutely hates the guy. He tells Rhys, "I'm done." Rhys reminds Joe that Joe's actions are the whole reason why Rhys has leverage. So Joe has nobody to blame but himself. He sits down next to Joe and starts pitching him on why Tom Lockwood needs to die. Joe asks Rhys, "What does Tom have on you?" And Rhys lies and says, "I have nothing to hide." The problem that Joe has is he knows Tom Lockwood is untouchable. A clearly frustrated Joe is at his wit's end. And Rhys says, "Look, I'll make you this promise. Kill Tom Lockwood, and it's the last thing I'll ever ask of you to do." Joe tells Rhys that he'll do it, but in reality, he just wants to find out what Tom Lockwood has on Rhys so he can take Rhys down. In order to do that, he has to get in with Kate. He starts going on dates with her. They're getting along great. And Joe finally gets his opportunity when they're walking around and she mentions how her dad is coming into town and she's planning on leaving to avoid him. And Joe says, "No, let's go out with him. I'll be there to support you." To Kate, it seems like Joe is just being a really caring boyfriend. But in reality, getting close to Kate means getting close to Tom, which means finding out the real reason why Rhys wants him dead. After Kate agrees, Joe goes into his office and starts Googling Tom Lockwood, trying to find out as much as he can about the guy. It's not great. Tom Lockwood's done a really good job of scraping the internet of any bad things he's done, replacing them with all the philanthropic things he's done. As he's doing this research, Nadia walks in. Nadia is super suspicious about Joe to this point. She doesn't really buy the fact that that woman was the Eat the Rich killer. She's not jumping to that conclusion just yet. And she wants to find out more about Joe. So she's using any excuse she can to go visit him, talk to him. And in this instance, she uses her short story that she wrote, asking Joe if he's had a chance to take a look at it. And Joe says, "No, I'm sorry. I actually been really distracted." She uses her story as an excuse to start questioning Joe. She asks him if he has any idea why this woman killed Malcolm. She wants to, quote, use it in her story. And Joe sees right through it. So to shut her down, he just tells her, Look, your story was convoluted and confusing. That's why I couldn't get through it. I didn't want to tell you, but I'm sorry, I had to be direct. Right before she leaves, she asks a question that only somebody that actually read the first 15 pages would have known. Joe answers it very matter of fact, but from Nadia's expression, you get the sense that she made it all up to catch Joe in a lie. Either way, Joe has no idea about it, doesn't really think much of it, because that night he has his dinner with Kate and Tom. Kate is really nervous, and Tom seems like a very doting father. But when she introduces Joe as Jonathan, her dad gets up close, introduces himself, and then whispers in Joe's ear, "Hey, Joe." That is something that Joe was not expecting. He then has to sit down with these two and act like nothing happened. While Tom and Kate are getting acquainted, Joe starts going through his head about what else he knows. Does he have any idea what happened in Madre Linda? Does he have any idea what happened to Beck? The more that Joe watches the interaction between father and daughter, the more he realizes that Tom actually does come off as pretty likable. Especially when he retells a story about Kate calling all of his contacts to adopt puppies. Even Kate seems to be kind of charmed by her dad. Later on in the dinner, Tom gets to the reason of why he wanted to meet with Kate. He has a waiter wheel out a model of a museum, the Lockwood Museum. He's collected all this art. It's just sitting in a building, and he wants to give it to Kate to populate a museum, which is her dream. He's already got everything in place. This thing's going to be in downtown Manhattan, prime real estate. He's willing to pay for all of it. Kate is hesitant, though. She feels like her dad has ulterior motives, and Tom says, "Look, I'm not asking you to say yes right away. Just think about it. This is your dream." She's so flustered by this that she gets up and excuses herself to go to the bathroom. And now it's just Joe and Tom, and they're able to chat. Tom gets right into it, asking Joe, "Did you kill Love Quinn?" A question that Joe says no to. Tom then asks him, "Have you ever killed anyone?" And that's when Joe starts to deflect. He tells Tom, I know you're worried about Kate. I would be too. But I'm a quiet guy. I only want a quiet academic life. Tom seems to believe the story and tells him, "Just don't hurt Kate or you'll meet the real me." He surprises Joe, though, because he asks about Rhys, and this is just what Joe was looking for. He tells Joe that he's a threat to his interests. He knows that the memoir that Rhys wrote is fabricated, and he also knows that the press is about to run a story on it. But he wants to know if Joe can tell him any more information that might benefit him. Joe stays quiet, and Tom says, "If you can bring me something substantial, I'll protect you." And it's at this moment that Joe realizes that he's going to use Tom to put Rhys in prison. When the night wraps up, Joe and Kate head home, but Kate has to tend to Phoebe. Phoebe has PTSD from everything that happened, and Kate needs to be there to just be a good friend. Kate really thinks that Phoebe needs to see a therapist and a mental health professional to help her out, but what Phoebe's really concerned with is the press finding out any of this. The great Lady Phoebe struggling. Kate assures her that getting away and getting some rest is the move, and she's willing to go with her just so that Phoebe's comfortable. A little while later, Kate is setting up their mini getaway when she gets a knock at the door, and it's Adam, looking absolutely horrible. After Phoebe turned him down, he lost everything. His club, his cars, but he realized that the thing he misses most is her. So he came hat in hand trying to win her back. Kate tells him that she's planning on taking him into a hospital, but he's able to convince Kate, and Phoebe for that matter, that he should be the one to drive her there. Kate reluctantly agrees. While Adam and Phoebe are leaving, right down the hall, Joe is trying to get his plan together to catch Rhys in lies. He sets up a camera, he starts recording on his phone, and he sends a text to Rhys that says, "I can see why you want Lockwood dead, given what he has on you." And that's just enough to get Rhys to show up a little while later. Maybe a minute after Rhys enters Joe's apartment, he knows that Joe was lying. He also can sense that Joe is recording, and when he checks Joe's phone, he sees that he actually is. He gets infuriated. So he once again shows Joe that he is smarter than him. He pulls out Marianne's passport. Joe can't figure out how Rhys even found Marianne. But at this point, it doesn't matter. Rhys gives him the ultimatum that if Lockwood isn't dead in 24 hours, Marianne dies. But if Lockwood is dead, then he'll let her live and go back to her daughter. The next day when Joe wakes up, he's getting texts from Rhys saying that the clock is ticking, but he can sense a different kind of tone in these text messages. And then when he hops on Google, he finds out why. Because that story broke about Rhys's memoir being partially made up. In response, Rhys has fled to the countryside. Because the clock is ticking, Joe unfortunately is running out of time. He's not going to be able to find Marianne in enough time, and he knows that he's going to have to kill Tom. As he's sitting and realizing what a crappy situation he's in, he gets a knock at the door, and it's Kate. Something really has been bothering Kate. It's the fact that she wasn't honest with Joe, so she's coming clean to him now. All that stuff that she said about her dad and the cancer and covering it up, that wasn't Tom. That was actually Kate, trying to be Tom. Tom had always put so much pressure on his daughter to be just like him and be successful like him that she started to. But finally, it just ate at her. She realized what a terrible person she was becoming, so she went the other way. And this really did a number on Kate. She tells Joe, "I'm not scared of being my dad because I'm already worse." I mean, Kate really beats herself up about what she did. She feels really remorseful. Joe listens. He tells her that it's going to be okay, that her past doesn't define her, and he genuinely makes her feel better about coming clean. When she leaves, however, he knows he has to choose between Tom and Marianne, and he chooses Marianne. He sets up a meeting with Tom in his office back at school. Tom comes with security, but he tells the security guard to go back to the car so that him and Joe can talk alone. It's just what Joe wants. He entices Tom with a first edition book on Winston Churchill so that he can look it over, and as Tom is doing so, Joe's about to stab him in the back. But Tom turns around. He can see in Joe's eyes that something isn't right, and he says, "I can see that you're scared to tell me the truth about Rhys, but it's okay." He then segues the conversation, though, to Love Quinn, saying, "I think you did it. And it's okay. She seemed like a maniac, but still, I think you did it. When push came to shove, you can kill. And maybe the most important part is you can do it well enough to get off scot-free. The good news is, Joe, I know where Rhys is. I also know that he's all alone and unprotected. So I want you to go there and kill him. And honestly, the alternatives aren't great. You're dating my daughter, living with some assumed name. I could take all of that away." He writes down the address of where Joe can find Rhys, and then he heads out. Well, this is good news for Joe. His girlfriend, Kate, gets some bad news. She's called Phoebe a few times to make sure that she got to the hospital, but she hasn't heard back. She's starting to get pretty concerned, and that's when Phoebe and Adam walk through the door. They're engaged. Kate, though, isn't happy for him. She yells at Adam, "You had one job to do. Get her help." She tries to tell Phoebe that she's not thinking straight, but both Adam and Phoebe don't really want to hear it. They're too love-struck, and Kate can't get through. Normally, Kate would complain to Joe about such a situation, but Joe had already headed out to the country to meet with Rhys. When he gets there, it's just as Tom said it would be. Rhys alone. He knocks on the door, and he's surprised because Rhys acts like he doesn't know Joe. But Joe barges his way in, ties Rhys up in a barn, and starts interrogating him. He starts asking Rhys, where is Marianne? But Rhys continues to claim that he doesn't know. Joe starts torturing him after reading a book on torture, and still, Rhys is claiming that he doesn't know where Marianne is, and that he doesn't even know who Joe is. Joe gets so infuriated by this that he starts choking Rhys until he can't control himself, and he literally kills him. Joe is really taken aback at what he just did. He didn't think that he was going to take it this far. He also realizes how much of a screw-up this was because now he's never finding Marianne. And that's when he hears a voice behind him say, "Well, isn't this a pickle?" And it's Rhys. Right away, Joe thinks that he's hallucinating. This new Rhys, though, tells him, "He wasn't lying, Joe. He really didn't know you. But then again, I wasn't lying either. We really do have Marianne in a cage." And it's true. They do have Marianne in a cage. Nadia had someone give her access to Joe's office. She started sneaking around, trying to find out anything she could, and she came across a key. She then got photos from Edward where Joe had this bag of an Indian restaurant, so Nadia headed there, and there was an abandoned building across the way. A curious Nadia entered it, went inside, and used the key to open up a door where there was Marianne. In episode 8, Joe realizes that it was him the entire time. The Rhys Montreux that he's grown to know was actually just a figment of his imagination. He can't believe it. Fake Rhys tells him that the actual Rhys, the one that's dead in front of him, wasn't lying. He didn't know Joe. Joe assumed that he did because every time he saw him in public, he did recognize him, so he would give him a nod, but they never actually conversed. It was all made up. It all started when Joe kidnapped Marianne. Up until this point, he thought he let her go, but he didn't. He roofied her drink and slipped her off the train, unconscious. He brought her back to his flat where he tied her up and gagged her, trying to convince her to get in a relationship with him. While trying to convince Marianne that Joe was the right person for her, he continued to drug her up. And she knew it. She knew that he was slipping her stuff, but she didn't care. She was thirsty at the time. But he wasn't just obsessed with Marianne. He was obsessed with Rhys Montrose. During this time, he was listening to his audiobook, watching YouTube videos, interviews. Everything Rhys, he was consuming. He didn't even realize it, but his new infatuation wasn't a woman, it was Rhys. All that Marianne was focused on was getting back to her daughter. She knew that she could use Joe's drugging against him. One particular night, Joe thought that he drugged her up, but she actually didn't drink whatever it was that night, so she was fully conscious, just pretending. This night, however, was an unfortunate night, because Joe puts her in a box and wheels her down to where he's keeping that cage. While he's dragging Marianne's body down to the cage, he's listening to Rhys's audiobook. All of that, though, is background noise for Marianne, and when she has her chance, she pushes Joe away and tries to escape. But Joe grabs her, pulls her off the steps, and it results in Marianne breaking her arm. Joe gets so mad at Marianne because he feels like she just doesn't understand. They get in a big argument about letting Marianne go to be back with Juliet, and Joe continuously saying, "I would never hurt her," until he yells, "Quiet! I would never hurt her." But then Joe gets weird. He just starts repeating, "This isn't me. I'm not that man." When Marianne looked into his eyes, she could tell that he was a different person. His eyes were empty. And then Joe bashes his head against the cage. Maybe it was all the Rhys Montrose in the background, but that's when he created this figment of his imagination. Because when he gets up, he flat out looks at Marianne and says, "I'm not Joe." Joe had developed a split personality. And that split personality would bring Marianne food every night, but he also brought her pills. Marianne got really worried because she knew that these pills would force her to relapse. She wasn't really quite sure why Joe would do this, but then again, it wasn't Joe that she was dealing with anymore. It was this fake Rhys. The real Joe was still convinced that he had let Marianne go. He was a changed man, but he wasn't. After Joe is forced to get rid of the body of the real Rhys Montrose, he and the figment of his imagination head to Joe's apartment where this figment sits him down and explains everything. It's hard to believe for Joe that he was talking to himself when he thought he was talking to Rhys. But the hardest part is accepting the fact that he hadn't changed, that he actually did murder those people. Malcolm for insulting Marianne, Simon for taking advantage of young artists, and Gemma was onto him. And it wasn't Rhys who killed them, it was Joe, although he doesn't remember any of it. This figment of his imagination represents who Joe really is. Even though Joe wanted to change and he went on this redemption tour, now, deep down, this figment is really who Joe wants to be. A killer. It turns out Roald was right the entire time. Joe was, in fact, the Eat the Rich killer. As he's having a conversation with his inner self about how crazy it is that he locked himself in a burning building, his inner self mentions that Marianne is in a cage, and she hasn't been fed in a long time. The thing is, Joe doesn't remember where Marianne is. The only one who knows where she is Joe's inner self. This fake Rhys isn't really keen to help Joe figure this out. Joe also knows that he has to get to class. Appearances are everything, and he needs to appear like everything's going all right. That's really tough to do, though, because the disappearance of the real Rhys Montrose has hit national news. Acting normal isn't going to be easy for Joe. While walking to class, he runs into Kate, who is dealing with an issue of her own, although a lot less serious. It's the fact that everybody's been invited to Phoebe and Adam's engagement party. And Kate knows that what Phoebe really needs isn't a party, it's psychiatric care. She's worried about her friend getting legally bounded to a leech. And that's exactly what Adam is. The hardest part for Kate is that Phoebe isn't returning her calls. She has no idea where she is or how to track her down. And Joe, who is half listening to the conversation, says, "Well, I've never seen Phoebe wear the same outfit twice. Just go to where she shops. You'll probably run into her." It's great advice because when Kate does track Phoebe down, she finds her, and she's surprised because Phoebe says, "You've been avoiding me." Kate assures her that that's not the case. She just says, "I think my messages got lost." She knows she has to play this thing delicately. She tells Phoebe that she's got a car waiting for her to take her to get that rest that they agreed on. But Phoebe isn't even listening. She tells Kate, I have something to tell you. That engagement party, it's not an engagement party. It's our wedding. Kate gets super concerned for her friend and starts convincing her not to go through with such a rushed wedding, and that's when Adam comes out and ruins everything. His ears really perk up when he overhears Kate mention the word prenup. He then proceeds to gaslight Kate, saying every time you're around, Phoebe's sad, and then they head off, and Kate wasn't really able to do anything she wanted. Joe also headed off to class, where there's one person amazingly missing, and that's Nadia. That's because Nadia found Marianne in that cage. After Marianne explains who she is, why she's there, Joe Goldberg, the entire backstory, Nadia wants to call the police, but Marianne says, no, you can't. It won't matter. He'll always get away with it, and he'll come back for me. Nadia, this guy stalked me halfway across the world. He will find me again. Marianne then explains that because of her daughter, she needs to do this in a way that gets her back to her daughter safely. Nadia vows to come back to Marianne with some kind of plan. And Marianne's advice to her is, do not let him find out that you know about me. Because of the run-in with Marianne, Nadia shows up late for class. But it's obvious to everybody in the room that she's just not as engaged. Joe especially notices and is a little bit concerned, so he has to speak with her after class. He asks, are you okay? And Nadia, thinking fast, blames it on Edward, saying that she's just having boy problems. And Joe believes it. Joe then heads home because he's got to focus on finding out where Marianne is. His inner self is still not being much help. He's pretty much turned his entire apartment upside down and hasn't found a thing. Eventually, though, with the help of this fake Rhys, he is able to find the key that's hidden in Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. But he's also able to find the box. He keeps one for everybody he's obsessed with, and Rhys is no different. It's got receipts, chewing gum, sweaty gym towel, but it also has a map of Rhys's favorite places to go. So he goes around town looking at these places until eventually he reaches the Indian restaurant, where right across the street he sees an abandoned building that would be perfect for keeping somebody hidden. In episode 9, Joe heads down to where he's keeping Marianne, and he is shocked. He can't believe that she is actually there in a cage, because he just doesn't remember any of this. He's so amazed that he's unaware of the fact Nadia is in the corner. Nadia had returned, just like she said she would, and she has a plan, although it's bold. She doesn't get to tell Marianne about this plan because she heard Joe coming and she had to hide. As he starts to apologize to Marianne and reassuring her that he will get her out, his inner self is telling him, don't make promises you can't keep. He tries his best to ignore the inner voice, telling Marianne that he's going to fix all of this. And all Marianne wants to do is get the hell out of there. But no matter how much she begs, Joe isn't about to do that. He has to formulate a plan before he lets her out. He also has a wedding to get to. That day is Adam and Phoebe's engagement party, which is really their wedding. He gives her a sketchbook to keep her entertained and says, I will be back with a plan, and then he heads out. Nadia and Marianne are then able to continue their conversation. They start discussing how they're going to get rid of Joe, and the best idea that Nadia can come up with is inject him with ketamine. She knows that Edward can get her some, and then it's just a matter of injecting it into Joe. She'll also need a drill for the door to let Marianne out, and Marianne says, can you also bring me a knife? Because Marianne wants some kind of security. Joe, meanwhile, didn't head straight to the wedding. He knew that if he was going to let Marianne go, he needs an exit strategy, meaning he needs to get out of town. He starts looking on the internet for signs of people that are hinting at being able to get fake passports, and he contacts one of them. While he's doing this, he's getting texts from Kate saying, where are you? Because she's at the party and it isn't going well. She was able to track down Phoebe, who was banging lines of cocaine like she's Pablo Escobar, and while Kate tried to talk some sense into her by not going through with this, Phoebe didn't want to hear it. She actually snaps at Kate because she is not thinking straight and is hell-bent on marrying Adam, even though Kate knows it's going to be a disaster. So after this blow-up with her best friend, she's frantically texting Joe, where are you? Because she needs moral support. But Joe is trying to find an exit plan, but also battling with his inner self again. And that's when his inner self reminds him that there's something deep in his freezer. When Joe goes to it, it's Vic's gun. He completely forgot that he put it there. And Joe's inner self wants him to use that gun to kill Marianne, because that's how he thinks he gets out of this mess, by ending Marianne's life. Joe doesn't want to do that, though. He wants to be a changed person. Joe tells the fake Rhys that he's going to go see Kate one last time, free Marianne, and get the hell out of town. That's how he's going to end this thing. And he heads off to the party. Kate can't fake the fact that she's not happy to be there. She shows Joe how bad it is by pulling out pills that she found on the floor, saying Phoebe is so pilled up that she doesn't know what's going on. I found these, and these are tranquilizers. In a last-ditch effort, she asked Joe to go talk to Phoebe, because whatever Joe said to Phoebe the first time they met really resonated with her. The problem is Joe doesn't remember what he said to her, but he gives it his best shot. As hard as he tries, though, he can't get through to Phoebe in enough time before Adam catches him, and Adam kicks both of them out of the party. A little while later, Adam and Phoebe are wed, but as soon as she says I do, Phoebe starts rethinking things, especially when Adam starts talking about business and spending her money. It's at that moment that Phoebe realizes what Kate said was right. This dude is a straight-up leech, and she quietly makes an Irish exit. Nobody notices. Kate and Joe, meanwhile, have nothing left to do but walk home and realize that they failed. Joe is trying to prolong this moment with Kate because he knows it'll be his last. He starts talking about, well, if this is the last time I ever see you, and that's a little bit confusing for her to hear. While it pains Joe, he does have to leave because he has more things to take care of before he leaves town. So he tells Kate, I have to go take care of some things. I will call you. The next day, however, is bad for Kate. It starts out with a phone call that Phoebe was admitted to the hospital. She's really concerned for her friend, and she's leaving her flat, calling the hospitals, trying to figure out where she is when she sees her dad waiting for her. Tom can tell that his daughter's distressed, and Kate quickly fills him in on why she's upset. Everything that happened with Phoebe, and mainly the fact that it's Adam's fault that all of this went down. He then, however, transitions to why he actually showed up. It wasn't just a quick meeting. He wants Kate to take over the company. Right away, she starts questioning what kind of skeletons he's hiding, how many kids are dead. But he looks at her and says, you've got to forgive yourself. You aren't your mistakes. And you've been proving that every day since you left us. You're ready to take over the company. She starts giving the reasons why she doesn't want to take the job, and Tom gets so upset that he starts scrutinizing her life. The fact that she runs a gallery, the fact that she's dating Joe, he just doesn't feel like this life is good enough for her. So he pressures her to accept this deal. And she doesn't say yes, but she agrees at the very least to think about it. She gives him her answer later in the day, though, when she finds out that Adam has been murdered. She knows exactly who was behind it. It was her dad. She approaches Tom in his hangar as he's working on his plane, and he admits, yeah, he had something to do with it. Kate thought that Adam was a problem, so he came up with a solution. It's that simple. And the cavalier nature of this murder is exactly why Kate doesn't want to take over the company. She refuses. She wants to be her own person. But her dad is fed up with treating her with kid gloves and says, you don't even get it, do you? Everything you have is because of me. Everything. Your internships, your galleries, your jobs, your apartment. You think you got it all on your own, but you didn't. I might not have been involved, but I was involved far away. I was the one who was paying for this stuff. I was the one who was giving the recommendations. I was the one who was calling in favors to get you these jobs. So, yeah, I own you. And the realization for Kate that her dad had handed her everything when, up until this point, she thought she had earned everything the right way is really tough for her. She's absolutely speechless. And before he kicks her out, he says, I'll give you a call later this week. We'll set it all up. Because as far as she's taking over his company. Joe, meanwhile, headed to check on Marianne, but his plan isn't perfected yet. He just knows he needs to feed her. She asks him, have you checked on Juliet? And he says, I'll do that now. He goes over to Marianne's phone and starts texting the woman who's watching Juliet, but he's really surprised because the woman immediately texts back, you contact me now? We thought you changed. You're losing custody. Juliet's grandmother's taking her. Don't bother coming back. Joe knows that this is going to absolutely crush Marianne, but he has no choice. He's got to tell her what happened. He tries saying that he's going to fix it, but Marianne loses it, saying, you're not going to fix anything. You did this. Joe, they think that I relapsed. I'm in here, and now I'm never going to see my daughter again. And the truth is, Joe has no idea how he's going to fix it. And while he's trying to think of a way, his inner self is telling him, you know how to fix it. Put her out of her misery. Kill her. Joe still vows to fix this, although he heads home and he starts frantically packing because he knows he has to free Marianne ASAP so she can get back to Juliet and explain herself. But that means that he's got to speed up the process of getting out of town. While he's packing, his inner self keeps arguing with him to the point where Joe gets so sick of it, he swallows one of those tranquilizers that belong to Phoebe, the same ones that he got from Kate, because he just wants to shut up this voice in his head. And boy, does he shut him up. He knocks himself out. And when he wakes up, a whole lot of time has passed. But the good thing is, the fake Rhys is gone. And he's got 2 hours to get Marianne out of that cage, onto a train, and back to Juliet. He heads over to the cage and tells Marianne, "You're free." But when he puts in the code, it doesn't work. And Joe always uses the same code. As he's trying to figure out what the code is, Marianne starts gasping for air, and she asks Joe, "What did you do?" She opens up the lid to the coffee that he brought her, and she says, "Peanut oil." And she starts choking. Joe is punching in code after code, but nothing is working. And he just has to sit there and watch Marianne have an allergic reaction. Suddenly, Joe is no longer in this room with the cage. He's visited by basically the ghosts of his past, like Jacob Marley style. Beck makes an appearance, although she doesn't give him the code. And even Love makes an appearance. And that's a pretty awkward conversation. And then Joe wakes up in his apartment, and the fake Rhys is back. Joe walks over to his freezer, grabs the gun, and then turns to the fake Rhys and says, "I know what to do. You're right. Freeing Marianne and running, that's not going to work. So I'm going to free Marianne, and then I'm going to end this cycle." But this inner self knows that by ending the cycle, it ends him. So he starts trying to pitch Joe on the fact that he's not suicidal. But there's no reasoning with Joe at this point. He's made up his mind, and this fake Rhys isn't changing it. He heads over to go free Marianne, but what he finds is extremely disturbing. Marianne appears to be dead. Now, the good thing from the dream was he was able to figure out a way into the cage. But when he does get in there, it's just too late. Marianne must have gotten over the allergic reaction, but the realization that she'll never be with her daughter again was too much, so she swallowed a bunch of pills. And it's coming at a really bad time, because her backup plan, Nadia, had gotten what she needed from Edward and was on her way over. In the season finale, it's tough for Joe, but he's got to get rid of Marianne's body. Normally, he would dump the body, but he knows that Juliet is going to want closure for her mother, so he just leaves her body on a park bench, and then he gets rid of the cage. The next day, he heads off to work, but the whole situation is really all I can think about. He's kind of just going through the motions in class, and that's when news breaks that Rhys Montrose's body has been found. That gives him the opening to just end class early because everybody's surprised by this news. But one person who didn't even show up for class was Nadia. She stayed away because she dove into who Joe Goldberg was. And when she Googles that name, everything that pops up, it's troubling, and it definitely is her professor. She ends up meeting up with Edward once he is released from class, and he's a little confused about their relationship. The way that she's been acting, he's worried that she was just kind of using him. And she apologizes, saying, "No, that's not it at all. She's just really frazzled by everything that's going down." She actually really appreciates him in this moment. Because she feels like she's going crazy, and having Edward read exactly what she's reading regarding Joe Goldberg would do her some good, because then she would know that she's not crazy. Edward reads the articles that she found on the internet, and then she goes to show Edward the cage in the building, but it's gone, and she's shocked. She feels at that moment like she actually is going crazy, because she has no idea what happened to it. She starts frantically trying to explain to Edward everything that happened with Marianne and the cage and finding it, the key, everything. The only question that Edward has is, why didn't you involve the police? And she explains that if she involved the police, they would poke around and he would run. She needs him dead to rights. That's going to involve digging into this and trying to catch him. Some kind of evidence that connects Joe to Jonathan, to the murders, to everything. Joe, though, is currently getting ready to flee the city. One of the things he wants to do is write Juliet a note so that Juliet doesn't believe that her mom died a junkie. As he's doing this, his inner self reminds him, "You are not suicidal." What his inner self is worried about is this recent report that Rhys Montrose's body was found, because there's not much that they can't do to connect Joe to the body. So while Joe's concerned with Marianne and Juliet and just ending this cycle, his inner self is concerned about staying clear, staying out of jail, not getting caught. As he's arguing with his inner self, he gets a text message from Kate asking him to come over, and he does that. He knows that this might be the last time he actually sees her, so he jumps at the opportunity. She tells Joe that she went to go visit Phoebe, and Phoebe was able to figure out what a leech Adam was, and when she gets better, she's going to leave town. Leave all that influencer lifestyle behind her. Start fresh. She then admits to him that she was planning on leaving town and cutting Joe off because she realized that she had been falling a bit in love with him. That really scared her because she's had trouble in the past with boys. When she was 18 and 19, she had boy problems because they would never stick around. She never could figure out why these guys were leaving, and then one day she overheard her father had hired somebody to follow her around. So she broke into his office and she found a file regarding everything. Everything she did, everything she had done, and everybody who she had done. When she confronted him, he said, "I'm your father, and the world isn't safe. I need to protect you." She then tells Joe about what her dad told her the previous day, about how he was involved in just about everything regarding her life. So to bring it back around, the reason why she was going to cut Joe off was because she was worried that Joe was sent there by her father, that he's not even real. And he assures her, "Kate, I am very real." She starts crying in his arms, saying he owns me, and he just consoles her. He knows he has to do something regarding Tom, so once Kate goes to bed, he texts Tom from Kate's phone saying, "Let's meet at your airport hangar." And Tom is very quick to reply, "Yeah, sure, no problem." But Kate isn't heading there, Joe is. He knows that he'll be able to get Tom one-on-one. He sneaks in and tries to sneak up on him, but he's caught and he has to quickly come up with an excuse on why he's there. He stumbles over his words, but he starts asking Tom if it's going to be a problem that they found Rhys's body because he figures that his DNA is all over it. And Tom assures him that it will not be a problem because he's got so many people in his pocket. The first chance he gets, though, when Tom turns around, Joe pounces, putting a chloroform rag over his face and then knocking him out. He ties Tom up, and now he's able to do whatever he wants with him. Now that Tom is tied up, Joe explains why he's doing what he's doing. Because ultimately, Tom Lockwood continues to hurt his daughter, and that's just something that Joe's not willing to let happen anymore. Tom tries really hard to get Joe to take a buyout, offering him just about anything he wants, but this isn't about money for Joe. It's about protecting Kate. The situation does get a little hairy, though, when Tom's security comes back from grabbing food, but Joe is able to kill him right then and there. And then he kills Tom. Having two bodies when he just expected to have one doesn't become an issue because now he has a murder-suicide on his hands. He ends up framing Hugo, the security guard, in the murder, saying that Hugo was blackmailing Tom for money. It went sideways. He ended up killing Tom and killing himself because he couldn't live with it. Because Joe has so much experience in this, he sets a very interesting crime scene where that is the only reasonable conclusion that one would have. It was just a really jealous, hard on his luck security guard trying to extort money from his boss. After he does dump the bodies off in a location that can be found pretty easily, he heads to the closest bridge that next morning. And the whole time, his inner self is trying to convince him not to do what he's about to do, but Joe is dead set on ending this cycle for good. His inner self starts to get really desperate, trying to convince Joe that he's actually a good person. But Joe knows that this is only going to continue if he continues to live. He knows that he's just going to continue to kill, and it's never going to end. So he needs to take matters into his own hands. He says goodbye to this fake Rhys, and then jumps in. But as soon as he hits the water, he immediately regrets his decision. Thoughts about everything that's transpired in his life come rushing into his head, and he has the will to live. And luckily, he does get that chance because somebody saves him, taking him to a hospital. He does wake up in this hospital, and he's pretty surprised to be alive, and that's when the doctor comes in and explains what happened to him. But when the doctor leaves, Kate comes in, because she had no idea that he was even suicidal. She's pretty pissed off at him for this suicidal attempt. But when she actually sees the state that Joe is in, she realizes just how severe this attempt was. It's clear to her now that the guy that she'd fallen in love with isn't as well put together as she thought. She knows that this guy doesn't need to be yelled at, he needs to be consoled in this moment. Joe tells Kate, "I didn't want to hurt you. But Kate, I've done terrible things. I've killed people." And he really fights with himself to even tell her this because he feels like he just got her back, and by telling her this news, it's going to push her away. But it actually doesn't. It's not like she gets turned on by it like Love Quinn did, but she's simply understanding because she remembers what happened with her life and how she killed people, although the circumstances were very different. Kate then switches the topic to her dad, telling Joe, he's dead. When the news came out, one of the people that was close to Tom and his company, Cynthia, told Kate about what Tom had Joe do by killing Rhys. She's not saying it judgmentally, she just wants Joe to know that she knows the truth. But she also tells him that the tests were inconclusive, so they're never going to know who killed Rhys. She doesn't blame Joe for this. She actually blames her dad for it, because the way she looks at it, my dad made you do it. Joe starts to argue with her because he doesn't want her to have to cover up his mess, but she cuts him off and says, it's done. He's left me everything. I own the company now. I'm running it. I never would have thought of taking over the company, but you have made it possible to even conceive this type of future. That's all because you've gone and made me believe in myself. Because of what Joe did for her, she tries to repay the favor, telling Joe, I know you're a good person. She then suggests that the two stay together because they can keep each other good. But in order to do that, she's going to need to know about his past. And Joe tells her, starting with the fact that his name isn't Jonathan Moore, it's Joe Goldberg. This will allow Kate to use her resources to make it clean for Joe to return to the United States. But as these two are discussing their future together, Nadia and Edward are trying to prove that this dude is a certified psychopath. While doing so, Nadia fills Edward in on her bold plan, the one that got Marianne free. That's right, Marianne isn't dead. Everything that happened was all calculated, right down to the text messages from the nanny. It was Nadia who changed the nanny's number to make it her phone number. So when Joe thought he was texting the nanny, he was actually texting Nadia. They set it up so that Marianne would look completely unhinged and a suicide attempt would be believable. But what Marianne actually took was something that Nadia gave her to slow her heart rate down. She knew that Joe wasn't going to bury her, so Nadia, waiting in the shadows, saw where Joe took her and then woke her up. Marianne was able then to sneak off and return to her daughter, and Joe Goldberg thought that she just died. It was genius, and Edward is completely amazed by it. But now they have to prove that Joe is, in fact, a killer. They head on over to Joe's apartment, and while Nadia is inside looking for evidence, Edward is outside keeping watch. It doesn't take too long for Nadia snooping around to find the box and find the evidence she needs, and she starts snapping photos. But when she leaves the building, Edward's nowhere to be found, and she heads to their meeting place, but still, Edward is nowhere to be found. He's not answering his phone. It's weird. And that's when Joe walks up on her. He's been discharged from the hospital, and he figured that something was going on with Nadia just by the way that she had been missing school and whatnot. So when he came home and he saw Edward standing outside, he knew something was going on, and he killed him. Nadia is so frightened that she's staring at this guy that she knows is a killer that she drops her phone and Joe picks it up, looking through the photos, casually deleting them, and then slowly backing Nadia up to the curb where she trips over Edward's dead body. Nadia is frozen still. She has no idea what to do. She's in shock. And Joe uses this to his advantage, taking the knife that he used to kill Edward out of his pocket and casually putting it in Nadia's hand. He explains to her that he's not going to hurt her, but what is going to happen is she's going to end up going to jail for a long time. He's also going to set it up so it's going to look like Edward was the killer of Rhys Montrose, and thus he is going to get away scot-free. No one's ever going to believe Nadia, and nobody does. When the cops arrive, she's thrown in jail, and she never even spoke on her defense because she knew that no one would believe her. All she can think about is what Marianne told her, that Joe always wins. And in this case, it proved to be right again. Now that everything in London is tied up, Joe and Kate are able to fly to the United States and take over Tom's company. They're leaving behind a couple of friends. Blessing and Sophie bought Sundry House after Adam died. They took it over. It's a place that Roald routinely hangs out after he returned from Germany on a hunting trip. He shot a close personal friend during this trip, although using connections, everything stayed out of the papers. And Connie usually joins them at Sundry House because he only lasted 9 days in rehab, and he still does a lot of drugs. Phoebe, however, was the one that got away. She was true to her word. She tied up all her business in London and left to teach English to elementary school students in Thailand. She's off the grid, no longer an influencer, and loving life. She's the only one who doesn't suck. But now, Joe and Kate are a power couple in New York City running the company. Kate did use her resources, and now the narrative is that Joe was able to get away from a psychopath wife in Linda Madre. It's an incredible story, and it's gotten Joe a lot of support around the country. Because of the story, they do have to do some interviews, although they have a PR person steering the conversation away from the tough questions. During this interview, they kind of just give each other a bunch of credit for Kate running the company so flawlessly, and Kate giving Joe a lot of credit because he spontaneously bought a bookshop that was closing down, which he tells the reporter, it's just a passion of mine. But another person is also in this interview, and it's Joe's inner self, that fake Rhys Montrose. He's still there. But this time, Joe thinks that he can keep him under control because he wants to do things for the greater good, like change the world for the better. He knows that in doing so, he might have to kill, but at least now he has a woman right next to him who is supportive of everything he does. And that is the end of Season 4. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. Make sure to share it on your social media platforms and be nice in the comment section because nasty comments make me feel bad. I have a Patreon, I have subscriptions, I have merch. Go buy a t-shirt or something, that'd be cool. But just know if you don't do all of that, I do appreciate you listening.